Jake adjusted his sunglasses, leaning back on the deck chair by his pool. He'd spent half the morning skimming leaves off the water, arranging lounge chairs, and testing the chlorine levels. His backyard might not have been luxurious, but it was good enough for a casual hangout. He scrolled through his phone, hesitating over the alien contact in his messages. Zyra had only recently joined the interspecies exchange program at work. Her strange, lilting accent and shimmering, almost holographic skin had caught everyone's attention on her first day. Jake wasn't sure if he was being bold or stupid by inviting her over, but hey, what's the worst that could happen? He typed out the message, "Hey, Zyra, wanna come over for a swim? Got a pool out back." Totally casual, nothing fancy. Zyra's response was almost immediate, "A pool? I accept. Is this an appropriate time for pooling?" Jake furrowed his brow but shrugged it off. "Cool, see you at 2, he muttered as he hit send. Her phrasing was a little odd, but she was still adjusting to human slang. He tossed his phone onto the patio table and began filling an ice chest with drinks. At exactly 2, the sound of a light knock interrupted his prep. Jake wiped his hands on his shorts and opened the side gate, his jaw nearly dropping. Zyra stood there, holding what looked like a translucent duffel bag. Her outfit was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. It clung to her body like liquid fabric, shifting colors with the sunlight. Her skin shimmered with faint bioluminescence, glowing softly near her collarbone. Jake's brain stalled, failing to decide whether to be impressed or deeply confused. Wow, he stammered, waving her in. "You, look ready to dive in?" Zyra tilted her head, her large, reflective eyes narrowing slightly. "Yes. Your message was clear. Pooling rituals are sacred for your species, correct? I prepared accordingly." Jake blinked. "Rituals?" She gave him a small smile, stepping into the backyard. "Yes, I reviewed the data you shared. Humans swim in open bodies of water, creating bonds through physical proximity and synchronized movements." She gestured at the pool. "Your ceremonial pool is smaller than anticipated, but I appreciate the invitation." Jake laughed nervously, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah. It's just swimming. Nothing fancy. Relaxing, fun. You know, hanging out." Zyra nodded thoughtfully, her shimmering skin reflecting the blue of the pool water. "Hanging out. Yes. A bonding phrase." She set down her translucent bag, pulling out a peculiar object, a smooth orb that began to glow faintly as she placed it beside the pool. Jake squinted at it but decided not to ask. "Water temperature is appropriate," Zyra murmured, dipping a long, webbed finger into the pool. Her bioluminescence flickered briefly, casting faint green ripples on the surface. "Though the chemical additives are foreign. Are they non-lethal?" Jake chuckled. "Yeah, it's chlorine. Keeps the water clean. Totally safe. Humans swim in it all the time." Zyra raised an eyebrow. "Fascinating. I've never seen a body like this before." Jake froze for a moment, caught off guard by the statement. Body?" he asked, glancing at her. "The water's behavior," she clarified, gesturing to the way it sloshed and shimmered around her touch. "On my home planet, liquid is alive. It moves with purpose. Your water seems docile." "Right," Jake said, feeling a wave of relief and embarrassment at his misunderstanding. "Well, our water just kind of sits there unless you make waves." Zyra tilted her head again, as if filing away the information. Then, without further comment, she stepped into the pool. Jake barely had time to process what was happening before the water around her began glowing faintly, reacting to her bioluminescent skin. She submerged gracefully, her movements surprisingly fluid. "Whoa," Jake muttered. "Wet and wild, huh?" Zyra's head popped above the surface. "Your terminology is curious. Does a wild indicate unpredictability or enjoyment?" A little bit of both," Jake said, grinning. Zyra seemed to consider this as she began testing human swimming techniques. Her attempts at a backstroke were anything but graceful, her limbs flailed in an almost comedic rhythm, splashing Jake in the process. "Hey, careful," he laughed, shielding his face from the spray. "This is less intuitive than I anticipated," Zyra admitted, blinking at him. "Do humans require extensive training for these movements?" "Nah. It's just practice," Jake said, sliding into the pool beside her. "Here, let me show you." He demonstrated a simple float, lying on his back. Zyra watched with intense focus before attempting to mimic him. Her body resisted the buoyancy at first, sinking awkwardly before a sudden burst of air escaped her gills, lifting her abruptly to the surface. She bobbed up and down like an alien balloon. Jake struggled to hold in his laughter. "Not bad for your first try." "I am adapting," Zyra replied, though her tone carried a faint note of irritation. "Your species' density control is perplexing." Jake smirked. "Just keep practicing. You'll get the hang of it." As they continued, Zyra's glowing presence began attracting curious glances from the neighbors. Jake noticed a head peeking over the fence and sighed. "Great," he muttered under his breath. "Nosy Mrs. Gladstone. Is this observation part of the ritual?" Zyra asked, glancing at the fence. "Not exactly," Jake replied, shaking his head. "Ignore it. She's harmless." Zyra nodded but made no further comment. She floated in place, her shimmering skin casting colorful patterns on the pool walls. Jake couldn't help but grin at the surreal sight. Maybe this was the strangest pool day he'd ever had, but he wasn't complaining. Jake leaned back against the edge of the pool, watching Zyra experiment with the water. Her curiosity was endless, and every splash seemed to bring a new observation. She ran her fingers through the water, her touch leaving faint trails of bioluminescent light that sparkled in the sunlight. "This water behaves strangely," Zyra said, her head tilting as she watched the glow fade. "It conforms to your movements yet resists total control." "Fascinating." "It's just water," Jake replied, suppressing a grin. "Not everything has to be complicated." Zyra gave him a curious look. "Your species often simplifies the extraordinary. This is why humans are intriguing." Jake chuckled, waving a hand through the glowing trails she left behind. "Trust me, Zyra, humans are a lot less interesting when you've been one your whole life." Before she could respond, Zyra moved to the pool's deeper section. Her form was fluid, almost unnaturally so, her alien physiology adapting quickly. When she reached the middle, she stopped, turning to face Jake with a smile. "Shall we commence the bonding gestures now?" Jake blinked, caught off guard. "Bonding gestures?" "Yes," she said with certainty, her voice carrying an odd blend of formality and curiosity. "Your invitation implied a desire for shared physical connection in a recreational environment. Am I mistaken?" Jake's face went hot. No, that's not. I mean, not exactly." Zyra raised a brow. "Not exactly? Then what are the intended objectives of this interaction?" Jake scrambled for words, his mind a jumble of panic and awkwardness. "It's just, hanging out. You know, relaxing. Like friends do." Her expression shifted, her reflective eyes narrowing slightly. "Friends," she repeated slowly, as if testing the word's weight. "So this is not an intimate ritual?" "No." Jake blurted, then immediately regretted how loud it came out. "I mean, no, it's just casual. Really casual." Zyra stared at him for a moment longer before nodding. "Understood. Human relationships are more nuanced than I anticipated." Jake sighed in relief, hoping to steer the conversation away from his growing embarrassment. "Let's just focus on the swimming, okay? You're doing great so far." Her lips curved into a faint smile, and she began to experiment with different strokes, though her movements were still uncoordinated. Jake watched her, noting how her glowing skin reflected on the water's surface like a living light show. Suddenly, Zyra paused, her gaze fixed on one of the pool floats drifting nearby. She pointed at it. What is the function of this object? Jake followed her finger and laughed. That's a pool noodle. You can use it to float or, mess around with it. She reached for it, examining the foam cylinder with intense curiosity. A tool for buoyancy and recreation, she murmured, her fingers testing its flexibility. Then, without warning, she gave it an experimental swing, smacking the water with a loud slap that sent a wave splashing over Jake's face. Hey, he spluttered, wiping his eyes. Zyra tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Did I misuse the tool? Jake couldn't help but laugh despite the soaking. Not exactly, but maybe go easy on the whacking. She considered his words before giving the noodle another, gentler swing. It still sent a modest splash his way, and she tilted her head again. The tactile sensation is unexpectedly satisfying. Humans create peculiar but effective objects. Yeah, we're good at that, Jake replied, swimming closer. Here, try holding it like this. He demonstrated how to drape it under his arms, floating with ease. Zyra mimicked his position, her movements careful as she adjusted to the noodle's support. When she finally found balance, she glanced at Jake, a faint glow of satisfaction emanating from her cheeks. This is enjoyable, she said. Told you, Jake replied, smiling. For a moment, the two floated in companionable silence. Jake felt the tension from earlier fading, replaced by a genuine sense of camaraderie. Despite her alien nature, and the occasional awkward misunderstanding, Zyra had a way of making the strange feel normal. But, of course, peace never lasted long in Jake's backyard. A sudden commotion from the other side of the fence drew their attention. A group of neighbors had gathered, peeking over the top with poorly concealed curiosity. Jake groaned, recognizing Mrs. Gladstone front and center. What's all that glowing about, she called, her sharp voice cutting through the air. You've got some kind of alien rave going on back there? Jake waved a hand dismissively. It's just a pool day, Mrs. Gladstone. Nothing weird. Doesn't look like a nothing weird, another neighbor chimed in. That water's lighting up like a disco. It's bioluminescence. Jake shot back, feeling his face heat up again. Totally normal for Zyra's species. Mrs. Gladstone said, clearly unimpressed. Well, keep it down. This is a respectable neighborhood. As the group retreated, grumbling amongst themselves, Jake turned back to Zyra, who was watching the exchange with quiet amusement. Your neighbors are observant, she remarked. That's one way to put it, Jake muttered, shaking his head. Sorry about that. They're just nosy. Zyra's lips twitched into a small smile. Their curiosity is understandable. Human-alien interactions are rare, after all. Jake snorted. Yeah, well, they could be a little less intrusive about it. She tilted her head, her reflective eyes catching the sunlight. Would it be inappropriate to include them in the ritual? Jake laughed, the sound breaking through his earlier frustration. Trust me, they'd find a way to make it awkward. Let's stick to our little party. Zyra nodded, her expression thoughtful as she glanced back at the shimmering water. Humans are complex creatures, she said softly. But I am beginning to appreciate their unpredictability. Jake grinned. Glad to hear it. Now, ready for another lesson in swimming? Always, Zyra replied, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. As they resumed their playful experiments in the water, Jake couldn't help but feel that this might go down as the most bizarre, and oddly enjoyable, pool day of his life. Jake leaned against the pool wall, trying to catch his breath. Zyra had taken to experimenting with human swimming techniques in a way that could only be described as chaotic. She had unintentionally turned the entire pool into a splash zone, her exaggerated movements sending waves in every direction. I believe I've mastered this freestyle technique, Zyra announced, standing waist-deep in the water. Jake smirked, wiping water from his face. Freestyle doesn't usually involve that much of flailing. She raised an eyebrow. Flailing implies a lack of control. My movements are intentional, though perhaps more vigorous than necessary. That's one way to put it, Jake muttered under his breath, grinning despite himself. Zyra studied him for a moment before asking, "What's the next phase of this bonding exercise?" "I've observed that humans often incorporate objects or games into their water activities." Jake nodded, glancing around the pool deck. His eyes landed on a small inflatable beach ball resting on a chair. "You're talking about pool games, right? Let's start simple." He retrieved the ball and tossed it lightly toward her. Zyra caught it with both hands, her bioluminescent skin glowing faintly as she examined the bright colors. "What is the purpose of this object?" she asked. "It's for games," Jake explained. "Like catch. You throw it, and I try to catch it. Then I throw it back, and so on." She tilted her head, her reflective eyes narrowing slightly. "This seems primitive. Is there a competitive element?" "Not for this one," Jake said, tossing the ball back to her. "It's just for fun." Zyra caught it again, her movements precise. "Humans engage in activities purely for amusement? How fascinating." "Hey, sometimes you just need to relax," Jake replied, shrugging. Zyra considered this for a moment before launching the ball back toward him with surprising force. It smacked against his chest with a loud thud, sending him stumbling backward into the water. "Whoa!" Jake spluttered, holding the ball as he regained his footing. "Okay, maybe tone it down a bit." "My apologies," Zyra said, though her faint smile suggested she wasn't entirely sorry. Jake laughed, lobbing the ball back to her with less intensity. "Let's keep it chill, all right?" They continued tossing the ball back and forth, Zyra gradually adjusting her throws to match Jake's gentler approach. Her natural coordination and adaptability became increasingly apparent, and soon the game took on a playful rhythm. As they played, Jake found himself relaxing more and more. He realized that despite her alien appearance and occasional odd phrasing, Zyra wasn't so different from the people he usually hung out with. She was curious, quick to learn, and, most importantly, she had a sense of humor. "All right," Jake said after a particularly long volley, "ready to step it up a notch?" Zyra's eyes glimmered with intrigue. "What do you propose?" Jake gestured toward a floating ring at the edge of the pool. "We'll use that as a target. The goal is to toss the ball through the ring from here. First one to score 3 wins." "A competition," Zyra said, her lips curving into a small smile. "I accept." Jake grinned, setting the ring in place. "All right, let's see what you've got." Zyra took the first shot, her aim precise but slightly off as the ball bounced off the edge of the ring. Jake retrieved it and took his turn, managing to land the ball cleanly through the center. "One for me," he said, flashing a smug grin. Zyra narrowed her eyes, her bioluminescence flaring faintly. "I see. This requires a balance of strength and accuracy." Her next throw was much closer, brushing the edge of the ring before dropping into the water. Jake took another turn, his shot narrowly missing. "You're catching on," he said, tossing the ball back to her. Zyra's next throw was flawless, the ball sailing cleanly through the ring. She turned to Jake with a triumphant smile. 1-1. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "All right, let's see if you can keep up." The game continued, both of them growing increasingly competitive. Zyra's natural precision and quick learning curve soon gave her an edge, and Jake found himself struggling to keep up. When Zyra landed her third shot, she raised a hand in a gesture of victory. "It appears I have triumphed," she said, her tone light but smug. Jake laughed, holding up his hands in surrender. "All right, you win. Guess aliens are naturals at pool games. Or perhaps humans are simply less adept than they believe," Zyra teased, her eyes glinting mischievously. "Ouch," Jake said, clutching his chest dramatically. "Right in the pride." Zyra tilted her head. "Your pride appears unharmed." Was that an exaggeration? Jake grinned. "Yeah, it's called sarcasm. I'll teach you about that later." She nodded thoughtfully. Sarcasm. Another element of human communication to analyze. They spent the next few minutes simply floating and chatting, the earlier competitiveness giving way to a more relaxed atmosphere. Jake found himself genuinely enjoying Zyra's company, her unique perspective adding a fresh layer of humor to even the simplest interactions. So, Jake said, glancing at her as they floated side by side, what's your verdict on human pool rituals so far? Zyra considered his question carefully. They are more physically engaging than anticipated. The combination of recreation, bonding, and mild competition is enjoyable. Glad to hear it, Jake said, smiling. Maybe next time, we'll try a barbecue. That's another human classic. Barbecue, Zyra repeated, her reflective eyes narrowing in thought. This involves open flames, correct? Yeah, but don't worry, Jake said quickly. I'll handle the fire. You can just focus on enjoying the food. Zyra nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile. I look forward to it. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the glow from Zyra's skin grew more pronounced, casting soft, colorful reflections on the water. Jake couldn't help but marvel at the surreal beauty of the moment. Thanks for coming over, he said, his tone more sincere than he'd intended. Zyra turned to him, her expression unreadable but calm. Thank you for inviting me. This experience has been illuminating. Jake chuckled. Yeah, I guess it has. As the day wore on, Zyra began to grow more comfortable with the various human quirks Jake introduced. The pool became her playground, a testing ground for everything she found peculiar about human recreation. Her fascination with the simplest things amused Jake, though he quickly learned that introducing new concepts came with its own risks. What's that? Zyra asked, pointing to the small cooler sitting near the pool. Drinks, Jake said, pulling it closer. He opened the lid and pulled out a soda can, holding it up. It's carbonated. You might like it. Zyra's gaze fixated on the can, her head tilting slightly. Carbonated? Elaborate. It's fizzy, like little bubbles in the liquid, Jake explained, cracking the can open. The sound of the tab popping startled Zyra slightly, her bioluminescent patterns flaring in surprise. Is it volatile? She asked, leaning back cautiously. Jake laughed. No, it's just air escaping. Here, give it a try. He handed her the can, watching as she studied it with a mix of curiosity and caution. Zyra brought the can to her lips, taking a tentative sip. The instant the carbonation hit her tongue, her eyes widened, and she recoiled slightly, the glow on her skin flickering erratically. What is this sensation? She demanded, staring at the can like it had personally offended her. Jake laughed harder. That's the bubbles. It's supposed to feel like that. It is aggressive, Zyra said, though she took another sip. This time, she seemed to adjust, her expression shifting to one of cautious enjoyment. The flavor is pleasant, but the texture is alarming. Welcome to soda, Jake said with a grin, grabbing a can for himself. As they drank, Zyra's attention drifted to the stack of pool floats nearby. She pointed at a large inflatable unicorn with an exaggeratedly colorful mane. And this? She asked. Jake followed her gaze and smiled. That's a pool float. You can sit on it and relax in the water. Zyra's eyes narrowed in thought. Its design is flamboyant. Yeah, that's kind of the point, Jake said. Here, I'll show you. He grabbed the unicorn and tossed it into the pool, climbing onto it with practiced ease. The float wobbled slightly, but he managed to balance himself. See? Easy, Jake said, gesturing for her to try. Zyra approached the float cautiously, her bioluminescent patterns shimmering with curiosity. She placed a hand on it, testing its buoyancy, before attempting to climb on. The result was immediate chaos. The float tipped violently, throwing Zyra off balance and sending her splashing into the water. Jake tried not to laugh, but the sight of her resurfacing, her usually composed expression replaced with a mix of confusion and mild irritation, was too much. It is not stable, Zyra said flatly, pushing her wet hair out of her face. It takes practice, Jake said between chuckles. Here, try again. I'll hold it steady. Zyra eyed him suspiciously but made another attempt. With Jake's help, she managed to climb onto the float, though her posture was stiff and uncertain. "This is peculiar," she said, sitting awkwardly on the unicorn's back. "Relax," Jake said, leaning back on his own float. "The whole point is to just chill out and enjoy it." Zyra hesitated before easing her posture slightly. As she began to relax, the float wobbled less, and her bioluminescence softened into a calm, steady glow. "This is unexpectedly enjoyable," she admitted. "Told you," Jake said, smiling. They floated in companionable silence for a while, the soft sounds of the water creating a peaceful backdrop. Jake found himself appreciating the simplicity of the moment. For all her alien uniqueness, Zyra had a way of making the mundane feel extraordinary. But, as always, the tranquility didn't last. Zyra suddenly sat upright, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the water. "There is a disturbance." Jake frowned, following her gaze. "What do you mean?" Before she could answer, a loud croak broke the silence, followed by a small splash. A frog had somehow found its way into the pool, its tiny form paddling awkwardly in the water. Zyra's bioluminescent patterns flared brightly. "Is this creature dangerous?" Jake laughed, shaking his head. "It's just a frog. Totally harmless." Zyra tilted her head, watching the frog with intense curiosity. "Its movements are erratic. Is it attempting to communicate?" "I don't think so," Jake said, still grinning. "It's probably just trying to find a way out." Zyra leaned closer to the water, studying the frog intently. Her fascination with the tiny creature was almost comical, her usually composed demeanor giving way to pure curiosity. "Should we assist it?" she asked. Jake shrugged. "If you want. Just scoop it up gently." Zyra reached out, her movements careful as she cupped the frog in her hands. The bioluminescence on her skin cast a soft glow over the tiny amphibian, making it look almost magical. "It is fragile," she said, her voice softer than usual.
"Yeah.
Frogs are delicate," Jake said. "Just set it outside the pool." Zyra carefully carried the frog to the edge of the pool, setting it down on the grass. The tiny creature hopped away, disappearing into the bushes. Zyra watched it go, her expression thoughtful. "Your planet's fauna is diverse and intriguing. Even the smallest creatures have unique characteristics." "Glad you think so," Jake said, smiling. "Though I gotta say, you're handling this whole human thing pretty well." Zyra turned to him, her reflective eyes meeting his. "Your species is unpredictable, but not unpleasant. I find your customs and behaviors intriguing, even if they are occasionally baffling." Jake chuckled. "I'll take that as a compliment." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the backyard in shades of orange and pink, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment. The day had been anything but ordinary, but he wouldn't have had it any other way. "Thanks for coming over," he said, his tone sincere. Zyra nodded, her bioluminescence glowing softly in the fading light. "Thank you for inviting me. This experience has been enlightening." Jake grinned. "Glad to hear it. Maybe next time, I'll teach you how to grill burgers." Zyra raised an eyebrow. "Another human ritual?" "Yep," Jake said, laughing. "But let's save that for another day." For now, they simply enjoyed the quiet, the glow of Zyra's skin reflecting softly on the water as the stars began to appear overhead.